Good evening, everyone, dear friends, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Thomas. I would like to give you all a very warm welcome. We today start a new series of web talks that Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is providing and offering. The German title of the web talk is called Rausgeblickt, which is, I'm afraid, a very German phrase. It means a bit like looking forward. That's probably the best translation. And the idea is very simple. It's based on the analysis that we have a historical moment, like it or not, and the Corona situation probably works a bit like a spotlight. It makes some issues more visible, more present. It puts some light on probably difficult situations we have in our societies, and the crisis might be a window of opportunity for change to the better and to the worse. And the idea of this web talk is to look on the chances for a better world, so to say, and to look how to make this change a positive thing. My name is Christian Krell. I'm deeply honored to host this talk for Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. And I'm very happy to have such a guest as Thomas Piketty here tonight. Thomas, if you don't mind, I won't give a full introduction into your CV. It's so rich, it would cost us probably all the 1.5 hours if I would give you your CV in detail. But let me just highlight some facts probably that bring us a bit deeper into the issue of today, into the question of how can we reach a fairer society. You are definitely one of the most known economists of the world. You're one of the leading economists of the world. You have a focus on inequalities, on wealth and income, and the distribution of wealth and income, and the link between both of them. And you've published widely. Let me just mention 2 books. One, of course, The Capital in the 21st Century. I think it was published in 2013. Yes. Long book, 800 pages, where you look at from a historical perspective at the distribution of wealth and income. And now we have a recent book called Capital and Ideology, where you look at I would say the narratives that legitimize inequalities in society, and also look at things that can change the structure of welcome and inequalities. And it's even longer. In the German translation, it's 1,200 pages. I'm deeply impressed. Thanks for being here with us tonight. And we have probably 1.5 hour, a bit less than 1.5 hour, and the talk will be structured around 3 issues. We will talk very basically on the question of why is inequality a problem after all? Probably a philosophical, but also a functional question, I would say. And then we will look at historical moments where the patterns of distribution have changed. In your book, you put a special emphasis on these periods, and you looked at certain periods where change in the distribution of wealth and income happened. And that's probably important for us to know what made it possible. And third, we will do a very close look on the current situation, of course, and ask what do we have to do now to make a fairer society. And we look at it on a national level, on a global level, and most important, probably on a European level. So that are the 3 issues. And to our audience, you are most welcome to join at any time. You can use the chat, which should be below this frame. Use the chat, ask questions, give us some comments. There's a team in the background that will deliver the questions to us, and then Thomas and I, we will try to pick up the questions. And we also have 3 questions where you can participate directly, and we will start with that directly, where we do a kind of opinion pool in our limited field. We will start right away with that, with a very simple question. Do you think that the current Corona situation might lead to a positive change in society? That's the question. The question is open for 2 minutes, and I'm curious to read what you think. But now I stop talking, and Thomas, I would like to ask you a probably personal question. I read somewhere that you enjoy going to talks and promoting the book and going to discussions, etc. But you said people have to understand that research needs time and silence. So what was your personal Corona experience? Did you benefit from more time, more silence?
Well, I mean, certainly for academics like me, you know, we are very privileged. I mean, we are very privileged in general. You know, we have a very, very nice job. We have a reasonably good wage. And during this time of crisis, you know, we certainly are not the people, and I am certainly not one of those who suffer the most, because, you know, if I have books, if I have archives, if I have a lot of, you know, digital materials that was digitized before you know, the crisis, you know, I was able to do a lot of new work. I stayed in Paris at my home and worked at my home for 2 months. I was supposed to be in the US and Mexico and Canada doing a book tour for the US publication of Capital and Ideology, which I could not do. And, you know, you know, I like a lot to see people and to meet students and to meet, you know, lots of people. And so, you know, I will have to do it another time and in this part of the world. But, you know, I just stayed at home and do some new, you know, research and archival work that I was very happy to do. So, you know, for people like me, you know, the lockdown and confinement was not such a traumatic experience. For people who have a very small apartment, or people who are homeless, or people who have very little income and who had to go and work, you know, it's a very different experience. So in the end, what this crisis illustrates is, you know, the very high level of social inequalities that we have in today's societies, and also the need to change the economic system.
Yeah, thanks for giving the broader picture and not only looking at your personal experience. Indeed, we as academics are more than privileged in this situation, and the crisis highlights the inequalities we have in societies. I remember during the first days of the crisis, there was the notion everyone is equal in front of the virus, and we very soon realized that's not the case. Mm-hmm. From a historical perspective, I learned from your book that every time when we have inequalities in societies, there's a need to justify these inequalities. Mm-hmm. So there seems to be a deep, I don't know, feeling or whatsoever that inequalities are unfair, unjust. What is the problem with inequalities?
Well, you know, I think every society is looking for the right level of equality or inequality. You know, I think nobody is asking for full equality, because people are different, people have different objectives in their life, and you know, there's no reason, you know, we should make everybody have exactly the same life, because, you know, different people are different, and that's good. So nobody is asking for complete equality, and, you know, I'm not asking for complete equality, but once you've said that, you know, you've not said a lot, because then every society, you know, has to find for, okay, we don't have complete equality, but we don't want to have a complete inequality either. So what's the right level, and how do you justify the level of inequality? And this is the story that I am trying to tell in this new book, Capital and Ideology, where basically I try to take seriously the different ideologies and give them a chance, you know, including, you know, ideologies trying to justify, you know, inequality in what I call trifunctional societies, you know, societies that were organized with a nobility, a clergy, and a third estate, which was, you know, pretty much every society before the French Revolution, not only in Europe, but you find different variants of this kind of organization in India, in Japan, or other parts of the world. And you know, it's not, I'm not trying to say that these societies were fair, but you have to understand that in the view of the time, you know, there was the idea that the two dominant groups were bringing something to society in exchange for their privileged positions. They were bringing law and order. They were bringing spiritual guidance for the clergy, and to some extent, educational services. And so the French Revolution, you know, replaces this narrative by the notion of ownership society, where everybody is equal, is supposed to have equal rights in terms of access to property and access to wealth. But in practice, in the 19th century, it's as if you have replaced one religion by another. You have almost a religion of property with a very strong sacralization of property rights, which I illustrate in the book by telling, for instance, the story of, when you have the abolition of slavery in the French slave islands or in the British slave islands, you have full compensation to slave owners. So no compensation to slaves, but full compensation to slave owners. And, a country like Haiti had to repay to France and to its US creditors also a huge public debt, 300% of GDP and public debt in 1825 to compensate slave owners for their loss of property. And they had to repay this until the middle of the 20th century. And in the view of the time, in the 19th century, for liberal intellectuals like Tocqueville, this was sort of obvious, because they say, okay, if you expropriate this particular group of property owner with no compensation, where are you going to stop? And so this was, this proprietarian ideology. And then in the 20th century, you have a whole set of ideology which are based on different forms of desacralization of private property, with more workers' rights in the boards of corporation, more progressive taxation of very large inherited wealth or very large capital income. And I think this worked pretty well. Other countries, including Soviet Russia, experimented other solutions which did not work very well. And, the collapse of this system at the end of the 20th century also contributed to this new form of pro-market ideology and sort of almost new form of sacralization of private properties that we still live in today. So, this is a brief summary of how, each ideology has a point, including Tocqueville ideology, including, the ideology of Ancien Regime, including, I try in my book to give a chance to all of this discourse, which doesn't mean that I don't draw, conclusion for the future. I'm trying to learn from this experience about the future. But I think before we can draw conclusion, it's important to really understand that each inequality regime, had some plausibility and was not just, you have no society in the world is able to sustain if you just tell, okay, we are rich, you're poor, and that's it. You need to provide some plausible justification for why it is so. And big crises like the one we have today, in history, often, lead to in effect, to challenge the current dominant view and dominant ideology, and can contribute to big historical shift and change in trajectory.
That's highly interesting, also referring to the little question which we posed to the audience. 75% of the people said, well, there's a possibility of change to the better. But let us look to that changes probably a bit deeper. You mentioned, for instance, the post-war period in Western Europe, where we had a significant change. How did that happen? What were the instruments, and what were also the forces in society that made this change possible?
Well, I think World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression contributed to accelerate a political and intellectual and ideological transformation that was somehow underway. And the reason why in the end there was such a big change in the structure of inequality and the structure of property after 1945 is also because you had this long run movement through the trade union movement, through the social democratic parties, the socialist party, the various forms of socialist and communist parties, which were sort of thinking, starting in the 19th century, or even starting in the 18th century. In my book, I show that there was lots of discussion, for instance, about progressive taxation of income and wealth during the French Revolution, which were not adopted at the time. But the fact that all this discussion about progressive taxation, about social security, about public and free education, basically there was a platform of action. And then the conditions for this political platform to be applied, of course, had a lot to do with the major drama that happened, in Europe, first with World War I, which to me is also, to some extent, the consequence of the enormous level of inequalities that we had, not only within each European society before World War I, which created a lot of tension, but also between European societies and between European colonial powers and their empire. And so the overall inequality regime before World War I was highly unstable, partly because of this international dimension of ownership and the competition, of course, between France, Britain, and Germany about who was going to own the world and get the profits out of this ownership. This led to the self-destruction of Europe during World War I and World War II. The Great Depression also completely changed the dominant view about the market system and whether the market system was able to self-regulate itself. So after all of this in 1945, there was more or less a consensus to put in place very strong regulation of financial markets, to nationalize some of the sectors, to put in place a social security system, healthcare system, pension, very large progressive taxation. We have to remember, in particular in the United States, which today, we see as almost like a tax haven and an haven for billionaire and high inequality. But in fact, for a long time, the US was actually, as a country, invented very steeply progressive taxation of income and wealth. So between 1930 and 1980, the top income tax rate in the US was 82%, and it was up to 91% under Roosevelt. And in Germany, the only time when you have a 90% top income tax rate was actually between 1945 and 1948, when the tax policy of Germany was set by the Americans, well, by the Allied Control Council, and they did the same in Japan between 1945 and 48, and they did not do that to punish the German elite or the Japanese elite, because at the same time, they were doing the same at home in the United States, taxing at 90% very top income. So in the US view of the time, this was actually part of the democratization package, if you want. You bring democratic institution together with the fiscal institution that will prevent democracy from becoming a plutocracy. And of course, there were many other institutional innovations. So for instance, in Germany in the 1950s, you have the co-determination laws that give up to 50% of voting rights for workers' representatives in the boards of large corporations. This is not a perfect system. I think we can improve it. But still, I mean, in Germany, you are accustomed to that. But in France or in the US or in the UK, shareholders don't want to hear about this even today, because they feel, what? Are you going to have 50% of voting rights without any participation in the capital, without any stock ownership? Then this means that if you have 10%, in addition to this, you have also 10% or 20% of the stock of the company, or if a local government has 10 or 20% of the stock of the company, then you can have the majority of voting rights, even though there's a shareholder that has 80% of the stock. This is in itself, it's a complete revolution in the very notion of property. And I think this is not over. I think we can learn from this experience and what was successful in the 20th century, in particular progressive taxation, public education, more workers' rights in companies. And we have to take this agenda further. We have to understand why this agenda did not continue after the 1980s, 1990s. We have to better understand this transition, and I try to do that in my book. But basically, we have to take back stock of this history, and I think narratives are very important for human society. Human societies need stories to understand their past and to redesign their future. And I'm trying to contribute to this in this book.
Yeah, and if I get you right, it's the narrative, and then it needs some chance, it needs some opportunity, it needs some forces in society, some developments, and when it comes together, both forces, so to say, the ideology, the narrative, and the events,
right. So
then you have change.
Yeah, ideological conflict in the end, I think, is the most important. Of course, crises, social crises or military shocks or pandemics or class conflict is important, but it's not enough. I really try to stress in my book that a pandemic in itself, or your class position, class conflict in itself, does not give you a theory of property, a theory of taxation, a theory of education. So you still have, lots of different possible ways. Regarding pandemics, of course, I wrote this book before the pandemic, so I don't talk about COVID-19, but I give one example of a major pandemic in history, probably the largest pandemic of all, which was the Black Death in the 14th century, where between 30 or 40% of the population died in Western Europe, but also in other parts of the world, in Asia, in China, in India. So it was really the biggest world pandemic of all. And it's a very different setting than today, of course, but it's interesting because for a long time, many people, in particular, many economists, believe that because of the shortage of labor, somehow the pandemic led in the end to more equality through the end of serfdom in particular. But in fact, more historical work has shown that this was a lot more complicated. And in some areas of Eastern Europe, or actually in Germany and the more eastern part of Germany, or in fact, you actually observe a reinforcement of serfdom after this period, sometimes in relation also with the rise of international trade in the Baltic Sea, sometimes through other mechanisms. The general lesson is that pure economic determinant, like a shortage of labor or a surplus of land, is not enough to determine, political choices. In the end, it's a matter of political mobilization, ideology, what kind of institution do we need in order to adapt to the new world, balance of power, of course, between different groups and who is going to win, because you always have competing ideologies and competing stories, and each story has some plausibility. In my book, I'm not trying to say, okay, this is the truth, this is the wrong ideology. I'm trying to be a lot more modest, although, it will be too simple as a scholar just to say, okay, I don't want to take position. I try to take position, but I try to do it, with respect for the different ideas and ideology in competition.
When we look at the importance of the ideologies, of the narratives, you earlier on mentioned the question, we also have to understand why that period, that post-war period, came to an end, and a different ideology, probably called neoliberalism, was dominant again. What is your argument there? Why did it happen?
Okay, I think there are three elements. One, you have the rise of Reaganism, Thatcherism, due to some specific reasons that have to do with the US and UK history. You have the fall of communism, which I think, contributed a lot to a sort of general disillusion with the idea of changing capitalism and changing the economic system. And the third reason, which I think is the most important, is the limitation of social democratic platform and social democratic parties and ideologies. And I think, these limitations have to do, in particular, probably the most important limitation of social democracy, broadly speaking. So, I include the French Socialist Party, the British Labour Party, and not only, the official social democratic parties of Germany and Sweden. I think the most important limitation was the thinking about globalization, and in particular about Europe in the European context. And I think in spite of the fact that these different parties, the SPD in Germany, the Socialist Party in France, Labour Party in Britain, were in power a number of times and had a majority, they were never able, in particular, to reorganize European integration and economic globalization in general with more, social objective, fiscal cooperation. So as you know, we still have the unanimity rule over taxation in Europe. And there was never really a program of reform of European institution, and that was so I think it's one of the major limitations, because I think that in the end, tax competition between countries and free capital flows without any common taxation or common regulation is one of the deep structural forces that make life very complicated, for social democrats since the 1990s. And the question is why, these political parties and organizations were sort of never able to put on the table a credible agenda for change. There are other limitations which I analyze in my book, in particular with respect to educational justice. I think in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there was an agenda for educational equality through basically the big educational push of getting 100% of a generation to the end of primary school and then secondary school. Starting in the 1980s, 1990s, with the rise of higher education and universities, it became, in a way, more difficult to define what educational justice was, because you cannot simply say, okay, we want 100% of a generation at the end of PhD, or you need to have a more complicated way to define what you mean by educational justice. And I think the social democrats, or the left, broadly speaking, was not very good at convincing voters that they still had a platform of equality. And I think, in fact, in many cases, these parties became more and more the parties of the highest university graduates, and partly because they were not, able to convince the lower socio-economic groups and people with less educational advancements that they still had something for them, and they still had a platform for them. So I think these new challenges with respect to education were very important. But I think the new challenge about globalization and how to organize economic globalization, is the most important one, and is still with us today. It was also, in a way, it's very similar to, if you look back to what Hannah Arendt wrote in 1951 in her book on the origins of totalitarianism. It's a part of her book which is not very often analyzed, but which I think is very interesting. She says the Social Democratic Party, again, broadly speaking, in the interwar period, their big limitation is that these were the only parties that were still, they claim to be internationalist in their ideology, but in their political project and political practice, they were very much sort of within the nation state. They wanted to build, the social state and raise taxation within the nation state, which they did very well in the post-war period, not so much in the interwar, but in the post-war period. But they did not completely realize, according to Hannah Arendt, the fact that with a world capitalist system and a world economic system, you also need some world politics somehow. And other ideologies of the interwar period, in a way, understood that very well, so very often in a very violent manner, either colonial ideologies, fascist ideologies, Bolshevik ideologies. But the Social Democrats were not really able to compete because they were too shy about world politics. And I think we have the same problem. We have the same problem today.
Was that also because it worked on a national level? I mean, you could argue that it was just not during a certain period of history, not necessary to work on a global or transnational level because the national way was so successful in the 50s, 60s.
Well, I think it would have been better even then. And actually, there was some discussion at the very beginning of the European community. There was some discussion about, can we have free trade and free circulation of capital without common taxation? Mm-hmm. There was some discussion, but in the end, the Social Democrats, did not really have a very strong thinking on these issues, and they did not. It's not that they lost the battle; it's that they didn't really fight the battle. And when the French socialists, negotiate the Maastricht Treaty with the German Christian Democrats in the 1980s, nobody seems really to realize that, if you have a free circulation of capital without automatic exchange of information about who owns what in which country, it's going to be very difficult to have any progressive taxation about capital income or wealth. And so today we are trying, we are beginning to realize the mistake. So we are trying, for instance, at the OECD to develop new system of automatic exchange of information about cross-border financial flows and financial assets. But, it's been a long time, and it's 30 years later, and we are still at the level of just talk and discussion, because, OECD, everybody pretends that now we all agree, we all want financial transparency, etc. But in fact, as long as you don't change the actual European treaties, and in particular the Maastricht Treaty, which sort of almost sacralized the right to move your capital wherever you want with no counterpart in terms of taxation, if you don't change this treaty, it's going to be very difficult. So I think, at some point, and you cannot wait for unanimity to change it. And I know that's difficult for Social Democrats, but, I think if the Social Democrats in Germany or in France, continue to appear like the people who don't want to change anything to Europe, unless there is unanimity, which of course will never happen, then, the only people who seem to have something new to propose are the nationalists, who say, okay, we want to get rid of Europe, we want to get rid of immigrants, we want to get rid of everything that is not purely French or purely German. And, these people are very dangerous, that, but, I think in a way we make their life very easy, because, the rest of the political spectrum very often appears like very conservative. Basically, we don't want to change anything. Okay, maybe we made mistakes with the way we built the euro 30 years ago, but now it's too late, too bad. We don't have unanimity to change it, so it will be for another time.
It shows us, interestingly, a close link between ideology and institutions, and it shows that ideologies are enshrined somehow in the institutions, and then they are fixed, even though the public dialogue and the discourse goes further on, it's still there in the institutions.
Yes. No, definitely. So here, the particular institution that we talk about in the case of Europe is, of course, the unanimity rule regarding taxation, the fact that you need every country to agree, and also the fact that the true governing body of Europe is the Council of Head of State or the Council of Finance Minister, and that they talk, behind closed doors, so you don't know, which argument, and it's really on a country basis. So you have one individual to represent, 80 million of Germans, one individual to represent 65 million of French, one individual for 10 million of Greeks, and all these people are supposed to fight behind closed doors. You don't know what they say. We are all trying to guess, what they say. Then you're supposed to have a unanimous decision. And then we realize one day later that they actually don't even know themselves what they have decided. And this is the way, we've been running Europe. I think if we don't change this, but, the good news is that it's not so complicated, to replace a bad institution with better institution, as long as we don't wait for unanimity. And from this viewpoint, I want to mention right away one interesting development, because I want to be optimistic, and my book is very optimistic in nature. I try to show that in the long run, there's a movement toward the reduction of inequality, and that this could and should continue. So one interesting small development, we can talk later about the new plan for Europe that was discussed this week or the last week, but an interesting development that happened last year, which very few people talk about in France, I don't know in Germany, was the creation of this French-German Parliamentary Assembly, made up of 50 members of the French National Assembly and 50 members of the German Bundestag. And they meet in Strasbourg. They met in February, I think, so in Strasbourg, there is a parliament that is not used a lot. So after all, why not using it? And, the problem with this French-German Parliamentary Assembly is that at this stage, it's purely consultative. So they're supposed to talk in particular about corporate law and defense policy, but it's purely consultative. And the other problem is that it's restricted to France and Germany, and I think it should be open to Italy and Spain and other countries. But at least what this shows is that it's perfectly possible for two countries, and in this case, these are the two most important countries in Europe in terms of GDP and population. It's perfectly possible for two countries to have a bilateral treaty and create new political institutions that could work with public deliberation, majority rule, in order to take common decision, including for taxation. And you can do it. You don't need to wait for the 27 countries in Europe to agree. And I think it's an important lesson, because I don't think we will be able to develop a common budget, a common public debt, a common tax system in Europe with the unanimity rule that we have today in the European Council. So we really need to think, and I think it's very important for the left parties in particular, to think about this democratization of Europe as well, of institutions.
So that brings us to the middle of the question of what to do right now in this situation. And then we are talking on the European level, and I would like to come back to that. But first of all, if you don't mind, Thomas, there's one question or one member from the audience would like to ask to you. And his question is, do you see any resemblance between the imperial age, there he refers to Hannah Arendt, and the last 30 years of neoliberal hegemony?
A resemblance between what period?
The imperial age, where he refers to Hannah Arendt, and the last 30 years of neoliberal hegemony.
Yeah, well, it's there is some resemblance, but of course there are many big differences. In the end, what put an end to the colonial or imperial age, in the first half of the 20th century, was this very violent competition between countries, and in particular between European state powers, where basically each country wanted to have the biggest colonial empires, and this competition ended up in self-destruction of Europe. And so, okay, this is probably not going to happen again. I don't think, the European countries are not on the verge of invading each other. So in this sense, the contradictions that we have today are very different. I think the contradictions that we have today in the regime of inequality and capital accumulation is that we now pretend to live under the regime of electoral democracy and universal suffrage. We have a system of globalization and global market competition that is supposed to work in the general interest, that is supposed to be in the interest of the masses, of the general welfare of the population. And in practice, a big part of the electorate is not really convinced by this. and big part of the middle class or the lower socio-economic class in Europe or in North America, feel that they are actually losing for globalization. And so that's a basic contradiction that led to Brexit, that led to Trump. And this is also the basic contradiction that's leading, every time you have a referendum in Europe, you find that the middle class or lower middle class or lower socioeconomic groups voter in particular vote against Europe and against globalization. And I think this basic contradiction could lead us to basically a collapse of the current system of globalization and possibly to a collapse of European integration itself. So it's a different kind of contradiction than the one there was before 1914 and led to the big crash of the 20th century. But in a way, the common point is that you have a regime of inequality and capital accumulation that's based on a story of common prosperity coming from just market forces and competition at a world level. But in fact, you have some internal contradiction which can lead this system to its end. And the question is this going to come to an end on the nationalist side or on the sort of more socialist or internationalist side? And now, just like at the beginning of the 20th century, both trajectories are possible, unfortunately. And as we know from the previous times, this can lead to political monsters. And today, these are different monsters, probably less dangerous, but it's still. We have to pay attention and think about an alternative discourse and an alternative way to organize the economy.
So, and that's probably a perfect time to think about alternatives. We had this period of 20, 30 years where politicians from both sides of the political spectrum said that there's basically no alternative. We have these forces like globalization, probably also digitalization whatsoever, and we can't do anything about it than just coping the development. We can't shape it. Yeah. So thinking in alternatives and probably thinking in a strategy for the political left to become more powerful, what would be your recommendation when it comes to a European strategy? What should be the alternative strategy of a European left?
Well, I think we have to accept, the European left has to accept that we made some mistake in the way we organized Europe. And in particular, the unanimity rule and the Council of Head of State or the Council of Finance Minister, cannot be the right way to have a progressive political agenda and tax policy and budget in Europe. So we have to propose something else. And so with a number of colleagues and European citizens, we have put on the table a manifesto for the democratization of Europe, which attracted a few, over 100,000 signatories, which is still small as compared to the population of Europe, but it's still something we are trying to contribute to this. And the basic idea is that it's actually quite close to this French-German parliamentary assembly I mentioned before. So the idea was, okay, how do you, what we could do, what would be easy to do, take France and Germany and take the French-German treaty that was signed last year. You could very well, in this same treaty, decide that this French-German assembly will have real power to decide about a common corporate tax on the profits of large corporations. And you could put on the treaty, okay, from now on, this will be the work of this joint parliamentary assembly to vote the law on the taxation of corporate profits, at least above a certain size in terms of size of profits or number of employees. You could do the same for the taxation of very high income and very large wealth. This joint French-German assembly would have the right to vote for common tax. Now, that doesn't mean that they will do it. Maybe, what will happen, if there is no majority in this joint assembly to vote for this, there will be no joint taxation and no joint budget. But, so the worst that can happen is that nothing will happen. But if there is a joint majority in the two countries, to adopt such a tax, and, I think even the center right in France and Germany, would prefer to have a lower taxation of small and medium-sized companies and higher taxation on large multinational, and the same for income tax or wealth tax. So I think in the end, if we had such an instrument, I think in fact it will be used pretty fast. And also the other important things is that political parties, when they compete in national elections, for the elections for the Bundestag or elections for the French National Assembly, they would have to make proposal at a transnational scale. They will have to say, okay, as a member of this joint French-German Assembly, what kind of budget will I propose? What kind of joint tax will I propose? Because in today's system, what I think is very perverse is that because national parliaments do not play any role in the governance of Europe, they can always say, okay, it's not my fault, it's because of Brussels, they do stupid things in Brussels, and so I think it's very important to actually put them at the center of the game, because in the end, these national parliaments, of course, are the parliaments that have the real power in terms of taxation, in terms of budget. And if we want to put money together at the European level, so for instance, if we want to create a common public debt in Europe, which maybe we are going to do in the coming weeks and months, each national parliament in the end will have to approve it. The German Bundestag, the French National Assembly. So the question is, do we want to continue with this system where each country has in effect a veto power through its national parliament on everything we might do in Europe about taxation, about the budget? Or do we want to put together this national parliament into a common assembly in order to take certain decisions, not about everything, not about every single piece of taxation or public spending, of course, but at least over this big decision about transnational taxation and transnational economic actors, and also the global and transnational public goods, including climate policy, university spending. So that's the basic, political change and institutional change that I have in mind.
So it has, as far as I get it, two dimensions. There's the dimension of multi-speed Europe. If you have a group of willing, go ahead, yeah. And the second dimension is a democratic dimension, yeah. Link it to the parliaments.
Exactly, yeah. The two dimensions are important, and of course, it's very important that this is open to every country.
Yeah.
So that's the problem with the French-German National Assembly, that it's only for two countries. But maybe this was just a first step. I think it's possible. I mean, we'll see what happens with the current initiative about the recovery fund and the public debt. But I think if there is a veto from Denmark or from Sweden or from Austria, I think there's a possibility that we have something like this. I think we should have something like this, even without a veto from them. And I think the current system of unanimity rule over all budget decision is just not a good system. And I think it's a very hypocrite system, because it means that in practice, you have all this pressure that is being made by France and Germany and the smaller countries, telling them, okay, if you don't accept, there's going to be consequences. But it's a wrong way. I think it's much better to have clear, majority rule decision. And in the end, our institutional system in Europe is completely asymmetric between budget policy, taxation policy on the one hand, and monetary policy on the other hand. Because of course, for monetary policy, we don't need unanimity rule. Otherwise, the euro could never have existed with the unanimity rule in the board of governors, So nobody, so, I think we are being completely schizophrenic with Europe because we know that when it comes to monetary policy or to budgetary policy, taxation policy, we need majority rule. We know it, how could have created the euro with unanimity rule? But then we sort of pretend that we can continue with unanimity over budget decision. But the proposal that is being made right now, it's very weird because we're going to say, okay, we're going to raise public debt together, but we're not going to tell you how we are going to reimburse it. And we will decide 10 years from now with unanimity rule how we are going to reimburse it. I mean, this is a very weird system. And when you think about it, I mean, if I was...
very optimistic approach.
Well, I think in the end, it can create a lot of misunderstanding because it's so hypocritical, because in the end, it's balance of power between countries. France and Germany, can try to put pressure on smaller countries. But, this is not a democratic model that suits. So the question is, what is the alternative model? So I know that, some European federalists don't like my proposal based on national parliaments because they would like all power to the current European Parliament. But I think this is a dead end. I think this is a dead end because at the end of the day, national parliaments and national governments have, will remain there, they will still exist. And they have in particular one very important power, as we've seen with the Brexit, which is to say, okay, if I don't like, Europe, I just go away. And so we are not in a situation where this right of national parliament and national government to go away is going to disappear in Europe anytime soon. So if you don't involve national political institution, and in particular national parliament, in the construction of a parliamentary sovereignty in Europe, this is just not going to work. So, this idea that, one day head of state will disappear and that national European Parliament will have all the power, I think it's an illusion. And I think we need to put the national parliament members, unseen if we want to replace head of state and minister of finance as true governing bodies able to take legitimate democratic decision under majority rule in Europe.
Yeah, and it would very much change the public debate, I guess. Yeah, it's closer to the national debate if you involve the national institutions, and that would make a significant change. But yeah. But given there was one question, and you already touched that issue. The question was, what kind of institutional change do you think is needed to make the EU area more equal? We talked about that, political structure, but I think the question refers to economic questions. You talked about tax harmonization. We touched a bit public debts. What are the instruments to make it more equal?
Right. So, I think we need to have a common public debt, but we also need to have common taxation. So right now we are discussing about introducing a common public debt. So, many people believe, okay, this is the first step toward common taxation, because once we have a common public debt, we need to create some common tax to repay the debt and to deal with the budget. I agree with that. Right now, I agree with that, except that I would prefer, that we do it in a clearer manner and more democratic manner, and I would prefer that we do it all together. So both the common public debt and the common taxation. So, right now, just to summarize the proposal that's on the table, that was made actually today by the European Commission, which is very close to what the French and German government described last week. Today, the European Union budget, it's about 1% of GDP. Okay, it's about 150 billion euro per year. So that's about 1% of the GDP of total European Union. And this has been like that for quite a long time. For the past 20 years, it has been stuck at 1% of GDP. in historical perspective, just to compare, if you take the federal government of the United States, it used to be actually not a lot bigger, about 2% of GDP until the 1920s. And then during the Great Depression, it grew to about 10% of GDP. And after World War II, it grew to 15-20%, and it has been at about 15-20% of GDP since then. But it used to be, until the 1920s, 2% of GDP, so it's not completely different from the European Union. The proposal that's being made right now is to borrow 750 billion euro over and to spend it basically over the next 5 to 7 years. In effect, we are borrowing, of the order of 5% of European Union GDP and spending it over 7 years. So we are going to increase, if the proposal is adopted, we are going to increase the annual budget from 1% of GDP to about 1.5, 1.6% of GDP. So that's an important change relative to the starting point of 1% of GDP. But as compared to the federal budget of the US, it's a small, very small step. And as compared to, for instance, what happened to the balance sheet of the European Central Bank. So, the European Central Bank balance sheet used to be the equivalent of 10% of GDP before 2008, and it has jumped to 40% of GDP. So in the past 10 years, we've created the equivalent of 30% of GDP in money creation, which is more than 3% per year during 10 consecutive years. So 3 times more than the entire European Union budget, and just behind closed doors, by pushing on a button. So this shows you, the consequences of the institutional asymmetry between the unanimity rule on the budget side and the majority rule on the monetary side. So what's going to happen next? Well, I think if we don't have a less asymmetric system, and basically if we don't have the power to tax in Europe, and I think it should come with very progressive tax. So our proposal in the manifesto for democratization of Europe is that the common European Assembly, say the French, German, Italian, whatever assembly, would have the power to create a common tax on high wealth individuals, high income individuals, large corporations, and high carbon emissions. And this could finance a budget to invest in green technologies, in universities. I think that's very important, and there's nothing at all in the proposal that was made today. If you look at the budgetary documents that were put online by the European Commission this afternoon, Erasmus budget, is still 2 billion euro per year, which is ridiculously small as compared to, we should be investing 50 billion euros per year, in European universities through European Union budget, using both public debt and common taxation. So this is an interesting beginning, but I think that's really just a beginning, and we have to be much clearer about where we want to go.
And the beginning, which is small, but still just probably possible due to Corona and the situation we are in.
Yes.
One has. We talked about Europe, and we have a bit less than half an hour, and I would love to come back to one of your other proposals, also because one of the participants asked for that, if you don't mind, and I would like to switch a bit to that proposal you made, focused around that phrase of a participatory socialism. One of the users asks if Corona makes it more likely that we go into this direction, but probably we can have a closer look at what you mean by participatory socialism. And probably also, what do you mean not? My personal experience is that if you say socialism, before you can explain what you mean by that, you always have to present 3 sentences about what it is not, that it's not state socialism.
Yes, now, I mean, you can call it participatory social democracy if you want. you have to see that in different countries, you know, socialist can mean social democracy. You know, if you take in Switzerland, you know, the French branch of the Social Democratic Party is called the Socialist, the Parti Socialist Party. So, you know, different people use different terms. I think what's important is to be precise about what we mean. So what I mean by participatory socialism in the last chapter of my book is basically, well, there are two dimensions. One is to have more workers' rights in corporations. So, you know, I want to have 50% at least of voting rights for worker representative in all corporations, like what you have today in large corporations in Germany, but I would like this also for a small, medium-sized corporation. And in the long run, you know, I would also like the voting rights of shareholders, you know, that, you know, should be capped in the sense that a single shareholder could not have more than, you know, a certain percentage of voting rights, maybe 10% in voting rights in companies over 100 employees, or, you know, but at least, you know, the general idea is that in very large organization, you know, you cannot have one individual, you know, who decides for, you know, forever of everything, you know, and the fact that you had a good idea at the age of 30 doesn't mean that, you know, you should take all decision on your own at the age of 50, at the age of 70, at the age of 90. So, you know, that's the first block. The second block that comes in complement to the first one is about the progressive taxation of wealth and the fact that we should have an annual progressive wealth tax so that you know, people who have very low wealth, you know, don't pay any tax and can accumulate wealth and access wealth, and people who have accumulated a lot of wealth, you know, have to give back to society, you know, a fraction of their wealth each year. You know, this is something that was approved, you know, that was actually used after big crises, you know, including in Germany after World War II, in order to repay the public debt or in order to compensate you know, all the people that had you know, forced migration from former eastern parts of Germany back to West Germany, and so you know, in these exceptional circumstances, you know, progressive wealth tax, you know, proved to be very useful. In particular, to reduce a very large public debt, you know, it's a much more clever way to do it than through inflation, which is like a wealth tax on the poor. And of course, Germany in the 1920s could see how inflation was bad, and that's partly why, you know, Germany used very progressive wealth tax after World War II, you know, in order to find a better solution. So this is another example of how societies, you know, are trying to learn, and also societies are always more than just one thing. You know, some people today in Europe view Germany as very conservative and economic issues, but you know, I think Germans and Germany as a country in history have been much less conservative than you know, German judges or some German economists, and you know, so I think each country has a potential for innovation and is a lot more complicated. So basically, I want to build on this, and this progressive wealth tax and tax on inheritance could be used also to finance what I call in my book inheritance for all, which will be the idea that there should be a minimum level of wealth that everybody should inherit. You know, we claim we live in a society of equal opportunity, and we try to develop equal access to education, to health, etc. And that's partly true. I mean, I think we could do a lot more in terms of educational justice and improving our health system, but we have built, you know, we have gone in the direction of equality over time. But I think in terms of inheritance and access to wealth, you know, we are not at all in a situation of equal opportunity. You know, we have lots of children who don't receive anything, and other children who receive millions or dozens of millions, and you know, I don't think they have better ideas than the, you know, poor children or middle-class children, and so I you know, I think it's not only unfair, but it's not efficient from the point of view of, you know, using all energies and all initiative, and so I you know, in the system I propose, you know, I should stress that, you know, it's only a first step, and you know, I think it's not radical at all. With the tax schedules that I propose, the people who today receive zero, who are about, the bottom half of the population basically receives, or even the bottom 60% of the population receive very close to €0 in terms of inheritance, today in Germany or in France. With my proposal, they would receive €120,000, which is about 60% of average wealth per adult. And the people who were about to receive €1 million, after my proposal, they will still receive 600,000. So there is still a lot of inequality between receiving 120,000 and 600,000. And if you want my opinion, I think we could go further than this. But this would already make a big difference because, people who own millions or billions maybe don't realize this, and for them it is the same to have 0 or 100 or 200. But in fact, it makes a big difference. When you have €100,000 or €200,000 rather than 0, or rather than just debt, which some people have, it puts you in a very different bargaining position in life in general. Because, when you have 0, you are in a very weak bargaining position. Basically, you have to accept any job, any working condition, any wage, because you have to pay your bill, you have to pay your rent. And you can see, in a situation like a pandemic we have today, if you have 0, saving, you have to work, you have to go out, even if it's risky, because, you need to get, whereas if you have at least, 100 or 200,000 euros, it means you can, well, first you can buy a home, you can buy an apartment, which means that you can take more risk in your professional career. Some people will create a business. Some people, people will do different things. And, I'm not asking for complete equality and everybody doing the same, but it will increase your bargaining power in life. And I think, in the end, that's really, the issue is about power. It's not just about money. It's much more than money. It's really an issue of control on your own life. Can you make choices? And so that's not going to replace access to education, access to health. That's not going to replace basic income. I want still a minimum income, basic income system. But I think this minimum wealth and inheritance for all can contribute to transform the power relation and bargaining power in society.
I think that's a quite important point. It's not just about economic aspects, but it's about the economic aspects related to power and to in the end, all the things that come with it, dignity, for instance, individual dignity. So the concept of participatory socialism has that notion of democracy, workers' rights, for instance, workers' participation, but also the concept of redistribution. And you mentioned 2 or 3 instruments. We just made an opinion poll among the audience, and 77% of the audience is pro inheritance for all. I personally would probably be even more pro if it's about, give it to the people when they are 45, not 25. So I could
but 45, that's very
no. It's just a very selfish argument.
You mean for your generation? Now, okay.
Exactly. No.
But okay.
Forget about it. I can very clearly see the argument for 25.
No, but we will have, if we were to do it for real, of course, we would have to find out a way for the transition, to deal with the older people. We have to find a solution for migrants. Look, it raises all sorts of issues which need to be discussed very seriously. But I think in the end, let me say this. It's in the complete plan, for sort of just societies that I'm trying to describe in the book. It only takes, in the budget that I present, where you have about 50% of national income for in total tax revenue. It could be more than that. I'm not saying it should be an absolute limit, but then you have to have very high quality public services, and you have to be very serious about how you organize all of this. But anyway, in this total of 50% tax revenue, the inheritance for all would only take 5% of national income in tax revenue. And the other 45% of national income in tax revenue will pay for public education, for public health, for public pension, public infrastructure. So, I don't want to make, this inheritance for all is not the magic bullet that's going to solve every problem, because that's a problem. Sometimes in the discussion about universal basic income or basic capital endowment, there is this very sort of liberal view, laissez-faire view, where, we give you a little bit of cash and then that's it, basically. You don't have any public services, etc. So what I'm describing is very different. It's only part of a more complete social, fiscal, and also legal system in terms of workers' rights. And that's, I think it's important to stress that.
Yeah, it's, I guess, also important when you look at the experience we made, for instance, in the more successful European states when it comes to an equal, more or less equal or fair distribution of wealth. When you look at the Scandinavian welfare states and when you look at the importance of the public services, it's not just, of course, about taxation, distribution of wealth, but it's about the public services that you mentioned.
Yes, no, definitely, and I mean, and we still have, we have to make a lot of progress in this direction. I know less well about Germany than about France, but I can tell you in France, I think the left parties in power, could have done a lot more in making the working of the public health system more efficient. The public pension system is still too complicated, and in a way, this is what left the door for today, Macron to pretend that he's doing, good things in this direction. But, that's partly because the left parties in power, I think did not do, what they should have done when they had the majority to do it. So I think it's, it's important to be very radical or at least very ambitious in terms of economic justice and fiscal justice, but also to be very ambitious about the making the public system and the public services more accountable, more responsive, and to permanently, do whatever is needed to make them more efficient. Otherwise, we're playing the game of those who want to get rid of this.
Yeah, that leads perfectly to one of the questions that was just raised. You were already talking about the political parties and the political left. Probably one German social democrat, I don't know, he asks or she asks, what are the possible structural reform projects you believe German social democracy should take up?
Well, I mean, there are certainly many of them, and look, I'm not here to give lessons, and I'm sure, there are many aspects of policy debate in Germany that I may not be fully aware of. So, I don't want to, but just to give one example, I think the reintroduction of a progressive wealth tax and a really ambitious progressive wealth tax, can be one of the policy issues that could make a difference, that could sort of show people that, the issue of fiscal justice and economic justice is an issue that the German Social Democrats care a lot about. I was very impressed by when at the time of my first book, Capital in the 21st Century, when I came to Berlin and I had a public discussion with Sigmar Gabriel, who was then Vice Chancellor of the government in Berlin, and he told me, we will never reintroduce a wealth tax. SPD will never support a wealth tax again. This is dead. We don't want to hear about this anymore. And when I came back to Berlin, that was in 2 months ago, just before the lockdown, and I had a public debate with Olaf Scholz, who is the new Vice Chancellor, and other members of SPD leadership, and it was completely different. And people were all saying, "Oh, okay, maybe we should reintroduce a wealth tax," and different people seemed to be competing with one another about how to introduce the wealth tax. So I think things are changing in this direction. But I think in principle, it should be also an issue that could contribute to to unite the left in general. So not only the SPD, but also Die Linke and also the Grünen. At some point they also have to decide basically whether they want to turn to Christian Democrats or whether they want to turn to SPD and Die Linke. In the case of France, what was very striking with the suppression of the wealth tax that was divided by Macron is that it happened in such a way that I think it contributed to a very large extent to the Yellow Vest movement, and in the end, to the end of carbon tax in France, at least for now. So just to recall, because maybe people in Germany have forgotten about this, but what happened was that when Macron arrived in power in 2017, he decided to repeal the wealth tax, which made a big loss in tax revenue, about 5 billion euro per year. And then the following year, in 2018, he increased the carbon tax on energy consumption, and this raised tax revenue by about 5 billion euro per year. And the government said, oh, but this has nothing to do. These are not the same 5 billion euro. The increase in carbon tax is because we care about the climate and we care about the environment, etc. But at some point, people told the government, well, look, you have 5 billion euros that we pay to the government, and then you're spending 5 billion euros the same year to repeal the wealth tax for the top 1% taxpayer. And this is really what made people completely crazy. And so they went in the street, they burned everything. And so in the end, what the government did was to suppress the increase in carbon tax, but to keep the repeal of the wealth tax. And now, nobody knows when a carbon tax can be reintroduced in France. Whereas before that, it was reasonably well accepted. And I think the general lesson from this, and I think this is relevant also for Germany and for other countries, is that if you want to go toward an environmental policy and a sustainable environmental policy, this has to come with more economic justice and more fiscal justice. And so I think the wealth tax, can also be one of these proposals that can, if it is advocated not only by SPD but also by the Grünen and also by Die Linke, that can sort of convince the electorate that it is possible to go in the direction of more protection of the environment without hurting the poor and the middle class, and by asking more effort to the upper groups in society. So I think both from a substantial economic viewpoint and from a broader political viewpoint, I think it can be a very important proposal.
So that's also why you asked for, or why you propose a progressive carbon tax, I guess, as far as I understood.
Yeah. So in my book, I propose to have what I called an individual carbon cart, where in effect we will be able to compute. And I can tell you more about this, to compute individual levels of carbon emission, so that we will be able to, in effect, make illegal extremely high carbon emission, or to tax very, very heavily very high carbon emission, and still to allow people who have a lower level of emission and more reasonable consumption of energy to be exempt from tax, or to pay a much lower tax. Now, when you say this, some people react by saying, oh, but this is going to be very intrusive, we will need to follow what everybody is doing. Now, remember that this is exactly what people said for the introduction of a progressive income tax, at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. People say, oh, but this is going to be very intrusive, and this was used as an argument. Remember also that, banks today, private banks, actually know everything we spend on our credit card. And somehow we have learned to trust them, not to use this information against us. And so I think it will be very strange if to start from the assumption that we can trust private banks, but we cannot trust a public administration that will be in charge of climate transition. So I think we really have to move in this direction. Otherwise, the flat carbon tax, which is in fact a regressive carbon tax because we exempt, airplane transportation, we exempt, a lot of high carbon emission individuals. So if we have this kind of very unfair carbon tax system, this is not going to work.
Thomas, one last question, one big question somehow. One of the participants is asking the question of growth, and I know it's a big debate, degrowth. We could, I guess, have another 1.5 hours on that, but he's asking if your idea of participatory socialism is based on the idea of further economic growth. Yeah. And he's making a historical reference that growth was always vital for the so to say, politics of social democracy. So is it still based on growth, and is it realistic to have that idea which is based on further growth?
So my view of participatory socialism relies on a redefinition of how we measure economic welfare and how we measure economic growth. So it would have to be a completely different kind of growth. So let me illustrate this. The first thing is we need, generally speaking, we need different economic indicators to measure what we think is growth and what we think is economic progress and what we think is economic welfare. So let me start with one example. I try in my book and in my work in general to always use the notion of national income rather than GDP, gross domestic product. What's the difference? National income is equal to GDP minus capital income going abroad, and most importantly, minus consumption of fixed capital, which in principle should also include all the consumption of natural resources and natural capitals that you do in a given year. So to take an example, if I take 100 billion euro in oil reserves from the ground and I burn it, this will create 100 billion euro of GDP, but in fact, it will be €0 of national income. And it is the same, if I take 100 billion euro of fish from the ocean and I eat it, it will be 100 billion euro of GDP, but it's €0 of national income because it's only consumption of fixed capital. In addition, if when I burn this oil, I create some carbon emission, which we have demonstrated as negative impact on welfare through global warming, and if we put a reasonable price on this carbon emission, then in fact it will be negative national income rather than positive GDP. So you can see that how you define your indicator of growth can completely change the way you evaluate not only the economic performance of a country, but also the economic performance of a company. And so it's, all these economic indicators, how you measure them is very important. Now, it's not enough, to use national income rather than GDP. You also need some explicitly environmental indicators, including carbon emission, of course, including biodiversity. And in my book, I report on some research we've done with Lucas Chancel, in particular at the World Inequality Lab in Paris, where we look at the inequality in individual carbon emissions level around the world. And this brings us back to the issue of a progressive carbon tax. So I think, we need to change the economic indicators, how we define growth, how we define income, how we define welfare, and we have to look at the inequality, the distribution of national income and other indicators of welfare. But we will still need, some way to compare the levels of income or wages across individuals over time. And when you compare the level of income between individuals and over time, and it's in effect, it's like a growth rate between two individuals or between two dates in time. And if we throw away every economic indicator, and we don't have any way to measure levels of income, levels of wages, level of wealth, and we only have indicators about the environment, then this may look very radical, but in fact, I think this is not radical at all, because this means that we will not be able to do anything, because you will not be able to define any notion of social justice. If we want, solving our environmental challenges will first and foremost require to construct new norms of justice. Who's going to change their lifestyle? Everybody is going to change their lifestyle, but in what proportion? How are we going to preserve, the economic opportunities and living standards of the poorest social economic groups in Germany, in France, across the world? In order to define a notion of economic justice and of equitable, progressive taxation, etc., you need some notion of income and wealth and wage. So, we need to transform our economic indicators, but we cannot just, throw away every economic indicator. Is not going to be the solution.
So we need clear indicators about growth and what kind of growth. It all reminds me about a book which was published in the 70s by Erhard Epler, one of the former heads of the Basic Value Commission in the 70s. And his main argument was that this debate, growth or not growth, is a wrong debate. We just have to talk about what kind of growth, in the sense of where do we want to have growth. Yeah. Growth that creates higher living quality instead of probably higher economic outcome. So
right.
It doesn't have to be necessarily the same. Yeah. So it's a long debate, yeah. And it has been a long evening. We are at the end of the evening, not at the end of the questions, I guess. We have asked our participants, what do you think in general about the proposals Thomas has made during the evening? Will they lead to a fairer world? And the numbers are growing. Now we have 80% who say yes, they will lead to a fairer world. So that's a quite significant number, a quite significant figure. Thomas, if we look back from, let's say, 2030 to the world in 2020, Corona is gone. We have a fairer, more just society. What do you think? What would be the most decisive thing that we remember, that we changed in 2020 to make it more fair, more just?
Well, maybe we will have changed our view about public services, the hospitals, the health system in general, and even more generally, the fact that you have lots of people who do their job and who don't work for profits and who don't work for immediate monetary incentives. And, this view that monetary incentives and market competition is the only way to discipline people and to organize society, this view has to come to an end. And I think, maybe this 2020 episode will be remembered as a time when we shift from this ideology of, competition and monetary incentives to a different ideology where, different human motivations can matter and the values of solidarity, both at the very local level and at a more global European level, if we are able to build, European solidarity, common debt, common taxation, that would be something to remember.
That would be something to remember. I couldn't agree more. And it's a big thing. I mean, it's a question on how we regard the human being. Is he motivated by economic incentives, or is he a social animal, a political animal? Thomas, your German publisher has written on the back of his book that you, Thomas, don't only help to understand the world we're living in, but also to make a change to the world we're living in. I think that has become crystal clear tonight. Thank you so much for sharing your analytical skills, your knowledge with us, but also thank you so much for encouraging us all. I think more than 600 people did follow us. Thanks for encouraging us all to make the world a better place. You have to leave now, and we fully accept that. Thank you very much for sharing 1.5 hours with us.
Thank you. Thank you for your invitation. This was very nice. Excellent. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Thomas. And to all of you, thanks so much for participating, and thanks for all the people who made the talk possible, for all the people at FES, the technicians, the translators. Thank you so much for all your effort. Thank you all for being with us. If you can't get enough of it, the good news is that the FES will provide a podcast of this talk, which will be provided, I guess, at this very place on the website of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. And I really much hope that you come back and that you join us. In 2 weeks, we will have Gesine Schwan here, the head of the Basic Value Commission of the SPD, and a highly interesting figure. On the 10th of June, she's here. Thanks for joining us today and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.